There is a specific kind of silence that exists only on a farm in late August. It's a heavy, expectant silence, thick with the smell of drying corn silk and the hum of cicadas that sounds like a live wire. My family has farmed this patch of dirt in Iowa for 4 generations, but I've never seen the corn act the way it did that summer. It started on a Tuesday. I woke up at 4 a.m. to the sound of the dogs, 2 massive blue heelers named Buck and Blue, whining at the back door. Normally, they'd be barking at a stray coyote or a raccoon, but this was different. It was a low, submissive whimper. When I opened the door, they didn't run out. They pushed their way into the kitchen, tails tucked, and hid under the oak table. I grabbed my shotgun and a heavy-duty flashlight, thinking a mountain lion might have wandered down from the north. I stepped out onto the porch. The air felt charged, like a storm was about to break, but the sky was crystal clear, a vast dome of indifferent stars. I shone the light toward the edge of the north field, the one we call the dead acre because the soil is a bit thinner there. The corn was 10 feet tall, a wall of gold and green, but it wasn't swaying, it was vibrating. I walked down the porch steps, the gravel crunching under my boots like breaking bone. As I reached the edge of the field, the vibration grew into a low-frequency hum that I felt in my teeth. I stepped into the rows. The corn was bent, not broken, not snapped, bent into perfect, fluid curves, creating a path that led deeper into the heart of the crop. I followed it. I knew I shouldn't, but the curiosity was a physical weight. After about 50 yards, the corn opened up into a circle. It was perfect, a 60-foot radius where every single stalk had been flattened in a clockwise spiral. In the center of the circle sat a pile of birds, dozens of them, crows, sparrows, hawks, all dead but with no visible injuries. They were arranged in a pattern, a series of concentric circles pointing toward the farmhouse. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was terrifying. I felt a cold prickle on my neck. I looked up. Above the field, a section of the stars was missing. There was no ship, no flashing lights, just a void, a triangular patch of absolute blackness that moved slowly, silently, blotting out the constellations as it drifted toward my house. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached the porch. I locked the doors, pulled the curtains, and sat in the kitchen with the healers. We sat there for hours. Every few minutes, I'd hear a thud on the roof. 1, 2, 3, like someone was dropping heavy stones onto the shingles. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. The void was gone. But when I looked at the roof of my house, I found the stones. They were the birds from the field. Dozens of them, perfectly arranged in a circle around the chimney. I went to the north field to show the sheriff, but when we got there, the circle was gone. The corn wasn't flattened anymore. It was standing tall, as if nothing had ever happened. But as I walked through the rows, I noticed something that made me drop my canteen. The corn was different. Every stalk in that 60-foot circle had turned white. Not dead white, but a shimmering, translucent pearl color. And when I touched one, it felt like cold glass. That night, the radio in the barn started playing. It wasn't connected to a battery. It played a series of rhythmic clicks and whistles, and then a voice that sounded like my father, who had been dead for 10 years. "Don't look at the sky, son," the voice whispered through the static. "They've already mapped the basement." I sold the farm a month later. The new owners told me the corn grew back thicker than ever the next year, but they mentioned one strange thing. At night, the dogs wouldn't go near the north field, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, the rustling of the corn sounds exactly like a crowd of people whispering a name. My name. My father was a man of few words and even fewer friends. He ran our wheat farm in northern Montana like a military operation. But there was one ritual that baffled me. Every spring, on the night of the spring equinox, he would go into the old shed, a place I was strictly forbidden to enter, and emerge with the Warden. The Warden was the most disturbing scarecrow I had ever seen. It wasn't made of straw and burlap. Its frame was made of heavy, black iron, and its body was wrapped in layers of cured pig hide that had been stitched together with copper wire. It had no face, just a flat, smooth head of leather. But the most unsettling part was the height. The Warden stood nearly 9 feet tall, with arms that ended in long, rusted, iron sickles. "It's not for the crows, Silas," my father would say, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's for the things that crawl when the wheat is high. It's a trade. We give it a place to stand, and it keeps the shadows out of our house." I laughed at his superstition until the year I turned 19, the year my father died. I buried him on the hill, and in my grief and arrogance, I decided the rituals were over. I took a chainsaw to the old shed. I wanted that iron monstrosity gone. But when I broke down the door, the shed was empty. The Warden was already out in the field, standing on its pedestal, even though I hadn't moved it. The wheat grew unnaturally fast that year. By July, it was over my head, a golden ocean that seemed to hiss whenever the wind blew. And then, the disappearances started. First, the livestock. We found a cow in the middle of the field, or what was left of her. She hadn't been eaten, she had been surgically dismantled, her organs laid out in a perfect line between the rows of wheat. Then, I started hearing the sound. It wasn't a voice, it was a rhythmic, metallic clink, 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 like iron hitting stone. One night, a heavy fog rolled off the mountains, thick as wool. I stood on the porch, a lantern in my hand, and looked toward the center of the field where the Warden stood. In the fog, the silhouette looked different. It wasn't stiff. It was swaying, but not with the wind. It was leaning forward, as if it were sniffing the air. I walked into the wheat, my shotgun trembling in my grip. The deeper I went, the colder it got. The wheat stalks felt like cold, damp fingers brushing against my face. When I reached the pedestal, my heart nearly stopped. The Warden was there, but the pig hide was split open. It was hollow, empty. A shadow moved to my left. I swung the lantern. 20 feet away, standing between the stalks, was something that looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, its joints bending at impossible angles. It was wearing my father's old denim jacket, but the sleeves were shredded by the long, rusted iron sickles that grew out of its wrists. It turned toward me. It still had no face, just that smooth, stitched leather head. But now there were 2 glowing amber slits where the eyes should be. "The trade is broken, Silas," a voice rasped. It sounded like metal grinding against metal. "Your father kept the hunger fed. You offered nothing." It moved with a speed that defied physics. It didn't run, it glided through the wheat, the iron sickles whistling through the air. I fired both barrels, but the lead just thudded into the leather hide like it was hitting sand. I ran for the house, the clink, 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 right at my heels. I burst through the front door and slammed it, shoving the heavy oak dresser against it. I spent the night in the attic, watching the wheat field through a telescope. Under the moonlight, I saw them. Not just one. Dozens of shadows, tall and spindly, emerging from the rows of wheat. They gathered around the farmhouse, their iron limbs scratching against the siding. They weren't trying to break in. They were waiting. The next morning, I found a small pile of copper wire on my doorstep, arranged in the shape of a heart. I understood then. The Warden wasn't a protector. It was a gatekeeper. My father hadn't been keeping the shadows out. He had been paying a tax. And now that he was gone, the tax had increased. I didn't leave. I couldn't. Every time I tried to drive down the road, the wheat would rise up, tangling in the wheels of my truck, the iron sickles slashing my tires. I live here now. I've reopened the old shed. Every month, I have to find something to feed the Warden. It started with the remaining cattle, then the stray dogs. But the wheat is getting hungry again, and its whispers are getting louder, calling my name in my father's voice. I'm looking at the Warden now from the kitchen window. It's standing closer to the house today. It's wearing my father's hat now, and it's pointing one of those rusted sickles directly at my bedroom window. The trade must be honored, and I'm the only thing left on the farm. My grandfather used to say that a farm is like a person. It has a face it shows the neighbors, and a stomach that is never quite full. I never understood what he meant until I inherited the property in rural Pennsylvania. It was a sprawling, neglected piece of land with a barn that leaned dangerously to the west and a farmhouse that felt like it was constantly exhaling cold air. But the most peculiar thing was the root cellar. It wasn't attached to the house. It sat alone in the middle of a barren patch of dirt behind the barn, a heavy iron door set into a mound of earth secured by 3 separate slide bolts. My grandfather's will was explicit. Check the bolts every sundown, never open it after dark, and if you hear a scratching sound like dry leaves, walk away, do not listen. For the first month, I followed the rules. I'm a city man by trade, and the quiet of the country made me paranoid enough to obey even the most senile-sounding instructions. Every evening, just as the sun dipped behind the jagged tree line, I would walk out to that mound of dirt and slam the iron bolts home. Clack, clack, clack. But isolation does strange things to the mind. You start looking for patterns where there are none, and you start questioning the sanity of those who came before you. It was a sweltering July night when the scratching started. I was sitting on the porch, drinking a lukewarm beer, when I heard it. It wasn't dry leaves. It sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard, a frantic, rhythmic scraping coming from the direction of the barn. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the mound. The air around the cellar was cold, impossibly cold for a July night. I stood by the iron door, and then I heard the voice. It didn't come from behind the door. It felt like it vibrated up through the soles of my boots. "Benjamin, is that you? It's so dark, Ben. Help your old man." My heart stopped. Benjamin was my father. He had disappeared 20 years ago, presumed to have walked off into the woods and never come back. The voice sounded exactly like him, the same gravelly timbre, the same slight lisp on the S. "Dad?" I whispered, my hand hovering over the first bolt. "I'm so hungry, Ben. They left me down here. Your grandfather, he was afraid. Please, just one bolt." Common sense screamed at me to run, but the grief I'd carried for 2 decades was stronger. I slid the first bolt back. The iron was so cold it burned my skin. Screech. The scratching stopped instantly. "That's it, son. Just 2 more. I have so much to tell you, about where the money is, about why I left." As I reached for the second bolt, I noticed something in the dirt. My flashlight beam hit the area around the door. The ground was littered with bones. Small ones at first, rabbits, squirrels, but then I saw a deer's skull crushed like an eggshell. And then I saw a boot, a weathered leather work boot, exactly like the ones my grandfather used to wear. It was still tied, but there was no foot inside, just a jagged, splintered piece of bone sticking out of the leather. I froze. My grandfather didn't die of old age in his sleep. He had been taken. Suddenly, the voice changed. It wasn't my father anymore. It was a chaotic mess of sounds, a dozen voices all speaking at once, overlapping, echoing, like a crowd in a small room. "Open it! Open it! Open it!" The iron door began to bulge outward, as if something immense was pressing against it from the other side. The second bolt, the one I hadn't touched, snapped like a toothpick. I turned and ran. I didn't go to the house. I knew the house wouldn't hold. I ran for my truck, the gravel flying under my feet. Behind me, I heard the final bolt shatter. The sound was like a gunshot. Then came a wet, heavy thud, the sound of something massive and soft hitting the dirt. I jumped into the truck and floored it. As I sped down the long driveway, my headlights swept across the field behind the barn. I saw it for a split second. It wasn't a person, it was a mass of pale, translucent limbs, dozens of them, all fused together into a mound of twitching flesh. It had no face, just a series of vertical slits that opened and closed like gills. And from those slits, it was still screaming in my father's voice. I didn't stop until I reached the state police barracks. They went back the next morning, but the cellar was empty. The iron door was lying 20 feet away, twisted like a piece of tinfoil. The inside of the cellar was nothing but a hole in the ground, lined with smooth, blackened stone that smelled of sulfur. I never went back to the farm. I sold the land to a developer for a fraction of its value. Last I heard, they tried to build a housing complex there, but the workers refused to stay on site after dark. They said they kept hearing voices coming from the drainage pipes, voices that sounded like their own children, crying for help from somewhere deep underground. I still have the key to the farmhouse. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear a soft scratching on my bedroom door. I don't answer it. I just sit in the dark and wait for the sun to come up. Because I know that once you hear the stomach of the farm, it never stops growling for you.